Greetings to you all. I'm Derek Korn, Executive Editor of Modern Machine Shop Magazine. Welcome to Future-Proof Your Job Shop with Configurable Cloud-Based ERP, a webinar sponsored by Keyed. Thanks for joining us. A well-configured enterprise resource planning system can make small to medium-sized machine shops more efficient and profitable. New cloud-based ERP makes these benefits more attainable while offering a platform that can grow with your shop. Today's webinar will explain how efficient information management can help your shop grow, how you can configure an ERP system to fit your processes and practices, how a configurable ERP system can grow with your business, and the advantages of cloud-based ERP. Our presenter today is Dave Lecleichner. Dave has 25 years of experience assisting small and medium-sized metalworking manufacturers in selecting and implementing ERP solutions. And he is currently the Director of Product Marketing for Keyed Manufacturing. Today's presentation will be followed by a Q&A session. It's easy to submit questions, and I encourage you to do so during the presentation. Simply type your question into the question pane on your screen, and we will do our best to get to all of them. So let's get started. Dave, why don't you take it away?
All right. Well, thanks so much, and a big shout out to Modern Machine Shop and Gardner Publications for co-sponsoring the event today. Thanks so much for that. For those of you that may not be familiar with Keyed Solutions, we are a leading provider of native cloud ERP and shop management, excuse me, solutions for small and mid-sized manufacturers. Again, it's a real pleasure for us to be here. And again, to reiterate, if you do have any questions during the course of the webinar today, don't hesitate to jot them down in the Q&A panel. We'll try to get to as many of those at the end of the presentation as we can, and we'll follow up with any of you that may not get your questions answered today. With that, let's go ahead and get started and take a quick review of what we'll try to accomplish today. Now more than ever, I think, if you own or manage a custom make-to-order mixed mode machine shop, it's pretty critical to have business systems in place that will help you to drive more efficient and streamlined processes. At the end of the day, those systems should help you to reduce cost and allow you as the owner or manager to focus on really increasing revenue and growing month-over-month profitability. The challenge as I see it today is that we're living in some really, really disruptive times. Multiple forces and technologies are converging that make it very difficult to keep up with what's going on, to really focus on what's important to your business and to really achieve those goals of driving lower cost and increased profitability. The issue is these forces and technologies are going to continue to converge and probably cause even more disruptive change. I think it's becoming a business imperative to really think differently in how we try to run our operations, how we interact with our employees, how we engage both with our customers and our suppliers. We have reached, I believe, a real inflection point where optimizing the business systems that we have in place to deal with these issues is absolutely critical. Many of our core business systems that many of us have in place today probably grew with us as our own businesses grew. We may have implemented them 20 or 30 years ago. And the challenge is, again, many of those legacy systems may not be set up to meet the challenges of the future. So if you're a key stakeholder in your business, I think one of the initiatives you should be regularly undertaking is really evaluating your core business systems that you have in place, probably every 3 to 5 years or so. And maybe even more critically, if you determine that those systems aren't going to cut the mustard, as it were, you need to lay out a game plan to replace those solutions that will allow you to better able to attract new customers, to potentially boost your revenue or increase your margins. So during the course of the presentation today, I hope to help you to maybe at least start thinking about, or maybe even formulating some answers to some key questions, including, how will your business management solution help you to meet the challenge of the next century? How will you be able to get exactly the system that you need that's going to fit your business, both what it is today and potentially what it is tomorrow? How are you going to be able to leverage some of these disruptive technologies, the Internet of Things, and various other technologies that will absolutely affect the next generation of manufacturing? How will you go about determining if your current shop management or ERP solution is really future-proof and ready for the challenges yet to come? I think a big question that you need to answer is, should you be considering the cloud? And if you do, when does it make sense to actually make that move to the cloud? And if you do decide to make the move to the cloud, how can you ensure that it causes the least amount of disruption and that the solution is going to grow with you and change and adapt as your potential business may change and adapt as well? I think it almost goes without saying that our world, and in particular the world of manufacturing, is changing and is doing so almost at the speed of light. So many of the things that we used to take for granted are changing extremely rapidly, or those things that we just kind of took for granted a few years ago may not even apply anymore. Take, for instance, how global our world has become. As manufacturers, today you might be shipping product to customers halfway around the globe, or selling to customers that are putting your parts into consumer goods that may be reaching people in countries or regions that you might not even be able to locate on a map. The world, I think, is experiencing some pretty explosive population growth in areas traditionally outside of North America and Europe. With this explosive population growth in developing countries, a new middle class and a new group of consumers for your products is growing. Conversely, in those developed countries here in North America and Europe, population in the middle class is declining. So net, your customers will be using your products and the parts that you manufacture that go into those products, and there will be a lot of new opportunity, new markets that are going to open up, new end consumers that you may not even have today. In addition, in those developed countries in North America and Europe, the age of the population is significantly changing. There is a graying of the population, which you are probably feeling in a couple of different ways. Number one, some of you may be experiencing the lack of finding skilled employees. Many of your skilled workers are leaving the workforce, they're reaching that retirement age, and you're finding it very, very difficult to try to find new skilled workers in the new workforce. It also potentially means that there is a whole slew of products that are being developed today that are going to need to support those aging consumers. As a result, I think the way that you do business today, both in terms of who your customers are and the types of parts that you manufacture, could significantly change. As we do become a more global society, we're also becoming a more connected population as well. One of the statistics I ran across the other day states that today that there are over 3.8 billion internet users compared to only about 400 million in the year 2000. This sevenfold increase in internet penetration has occurred surprisingly again in those developing countries that I mentioned earlier. This connectedness that we are experiencing today is due in large part to rapidly changing technology. Take, for example, what has probably happened in our own lifetimes. We have gone from manually submitting job time cards and filing them away in file cabinets to maybe at some point your company invested in computer systems, albeit they probably cost you potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars or required literally millions of dollars in investment, entire rooms in your company to house, and entire staffs to maintain. To the point that we reached in the 1980s, where you could have that same and equivalent computer power sitting on your desk in the form of a desktop computer, to what we're actually dealing with today, which is more computing power than that 1975 Cray supercomputer that I illustrated earlier. And literally, that power can sit and reside in the palm of your hand. And honestly, this transformation of power, affordability, and availability of devices driven by all of these advances is nowhere near done yet. Would you believe that by the year 2020, for example, it's estimated that there's going to be between 30 billion and 50 billion connected devices in use across the world being used every single day? If you do the math, that averages out to between 4 and 6 devices per every man, woman, and child that will be on the earth. Pretty unbelievable. As a result, all of those connected people are going to want, need, and demand systems that help them to stay connected. Another amazing statistic is that in 2017 alone, just last year, in a one-year time period, people downloaded over 90 billion apps to their smart devices. And as you look at what these apps were trying to do and what they were by their very nature, it was a means to connect people on a social level. This desire to stay connected and the expectation of even more connectedness is probably going to start to spill over more and more in our business lives as well. People expect to be connected to their jobs and to their workspaces just like they are in their social life. Your customers, for example, will expect at some level to do business with you 24/7. They want to be connected with you as a business just like they are with their family and friends. This connectedness is really driving a different consumption model for the information that we have. Imagine our own lives today just for a moment. 70% of us are checking our work emails every day outside of normal business hours. 42% of us log into our emails when we're actually away on vacation. Another 43% of us connect to our emails ahead of our workday. And honestly, that number to me seems a little conservative. I know from my own experience, almost every single day before I get into my car to head to the office, I'm checking my email so I can get a jump start on the day. And this is pretty compelling. 91% of us actually check our smart devices every 6 to 12 minutes. So what does this really mean and imply for manufacturing? I actually think a whole lot. All of this, from the globalization of our world to those technological advances that I just mentioned, to that need to be connected, means that it's going to continue to place tremendous pressure on our core manufacturing systems. It will mean in some cases that this disruption is going to actually drive, I believe, new business models and put increased pressure on our core and legacy ERP systems. Let's face it, ERP systems are nothing new. They've been around for a good number of years, all the way back to the MRP systems back in the 1960s. In the old days, it was almost a foregone conclusion that if you implemented an information system, it would, by its nature, make you more efficient. Is that still really the case today? I think that's a very valid question, and everyone needs to evaluate that for themselves. For sure, as our world continues to get smaller, as technology allows manufacturers and consumers from all around the world to interact and to do business with one another easier, cheaper than ever before, it's going to mean at the end of the day that our supply chains are going to become much more complex. Often, even if you have an ERP system in place today, it may not be robust enough to handle this new globalization of supply chains. In addition, traditional information systems were architected in an age when people went to an office or to the shop with four walls and they worked from 8 to 5. As business now starts to take place anywhere, as your customers continue to expect answers from you 24/7, as people become more connected in their personal life and want this same level of connectedness with their suppliers and customers, it's going to mean that our key business systems are going to need to adapt and to change to this new paradigm. People want data in just the format that they want, through whatever device that they want, anytime that they want, and anywhere that they're at in the world. The traditional concept of where and how business is conducted will undergo, I think, some pretty radical changes. And with all of this connectedness, with all of this business happening literally anywhere and anytime, we're just simply going to see the amount of data we have access to continue to expand. For example, studies have shown that 90% of the world's data that we have today has actually been created just in the last 2 years. Another statistic that I heard was in the year 2000, we actually doubled the amount of data just in that year than all 5,000 years of previously recorded history. And you know what? It's just going to get more and more complex. The Internet of Things will continue to take deeper hold. Traditionally, if you think about it, data actually came and was largely generated by people. In the future, more and more of that data is actually going to come from inanimate objects. Data is actually going to start coming from the parts that you actually will manufacture, or the devices that consumers or that your customers will manufacture from the parts that you supply them. With the advent of microtechnology, nanosensors, 3D printing, literally this ability to embed sensors into the very parts that you manufacture, the magnitude of data generated from those devices will require that systems become more and more adept at dealing with that volume of data. And with all of this data, you're going to need systems that will help you make sense of it all. For example, just recently I was reading an article that Boeing's new 787 aircraft will generate over 1/2 a terabyte with a T of data per flight. That's pretty incredible. Ultimately, the benefit of all of this data coming from all of these different sources, literally from the parts that we manufacture, will be the ability to gain much more insight and allow our businesses potentially to become even more efficient. It's going to allow our manufacturing operations to grow without the need of adding new people. However, we can really only start to leverage all of the benefits of this information with new systems that will help us to make sense of it all. There is honestly no way that we as human beings will have the power to make sense of all of this new data on our own. Our information systems are going to need to change. Traditionally, if you look at ERP, it was designed to simply administer your business. Our systems in the future are going to need to become more smart. Our systems will need to move beyond just that administration of data, which is what most of the legacy ERP systems do very well, to actually helping us visualize that data in a way that we can drive action from that data. At the end of the day, I think the greatest opportunity for even small machine shops will be that you will be able to start leveraging that data and move from being reactive, which many of you are probably today, to being more predictive and more proactive. Imagine a day when your core business system would actually be able to anticipate when one of your customers should be placing an order with you. Imagine that your system would then automatically email that customer when he or she hasn't actually placed an order to remind them to actually place the order. Then imagine that when your customer system receives that notification or that email, that it actually in their system automatically creates a purchase order back to you and places that purchase order directly back into your system without any human interaction. It almost sounds a bit far-fetched. Well, maybe, but we're getting really close. I can tell you from a software vendor's perspective, that is how we are thinking, and that is how we are trying to architect the next generation of ERP. And if you think all of this really doesn't apply to you and it maybe is for someone else, studies are starting to show that one of the biggest industries that will reap the most from all of this data that will be coming from the Internet of Things is going to be manufacturing. So at the end of the day, what does it all mean? It means, I think, that you as a business owner need to start preparing today for this new way of doing business tomorrow. You need to be embracing some of these enablers that will help you to actually get there. Without sounding maybe a bit biased, I'm a firm believer that the legacy ERP and information management systems of yesterday will need to be re-architected from the ground up. I really believe the cloud is going to become the great enabler of the future. The cloud, combined with everything that I previously discussed, will allow you as a manufacturer to become more customer centric, to potentially even become more specialized in what you do. It will allow you to be more collaborative, more distinctive than your competition, more agile and more automated than ever before. All of this combined means that the leading edge manufacturer, those top shops of tomorrow, will be embracing some of these key enablers like the cloud and will be able to generate more revenue at a reduced cost compared to their competitors. So how does a manufacturer actually become more educated about what's going on and how they can actually start leveraging these new ERP systems that are being developed? I think first and foremost, you need to keep getting yourself up to speed. Things will continue to evolve and change very rapidly. So keeping abreast of those changes, connecting with industry experts through webinars like this and others are great tools. Your state affiliated manufacturing extension partnerships would also be a great sponsor of events that I would connect with as well. I think the next thing you need to do is to evaluate where your own shop is today on its information management journey. I love this graphic because at some level, it can maybe even start to paint a picture of how you might start to leverage some of this new technology, and especially the cloud and the advantages that it may offer you. Keep in mind that while a lot of the things that I've talked about today are somewhat revolutionary, your move toward embracing some of these technologies and some of these enablers could actually be evolutionary. Related to the previous graphic, you need to understand there's lots of options that are going to be available for you as you start looking at potentially moving to the cloud, especially as it relates to deployment options. So one of the key things I think you have to remember and know is the difference and the pros and cons of simply, for example, hosting your current ERP solution somewhere in the cloud versus maybe taking a potentially different approach. Maybe hosting your current legacy system isn't the only way. You might actually consider potentially a hybrid approach. You may have some combination of your core solution, your ERP solution, that may actually still reside on premise, but some of the other supporting solutions might actually be available in the cloud outside of the walls, four walls of your company. Or you might be ready to go full bore into the cloud, where all of your applications that are core and central to your business are actually architected and built for the cloud and in the cloud and actually optimized for use on any device, no matter where you're at in the world. Then I think as you begin to think about your potential move to the cloud, you need to start considering what type of cloud you might want to leverage. In general, you're going to have two options. You might decide to go the private cloud route. Very simply, private cloud refers to a model of cloud computing where all of the IT services, all of the core infrastructure are provisioned and supported in a private infrastructure for a single organization. A private cloud is usually managed very often by your own resources, meaning your own employees would actually manage, set up, and support that infrastructure. Obviously, what that means for you is that you and or your company will need to have the expertise to manage that infrastructure, to deploy your solutions, and to support those applications in the cloud. So it's another level of complexity, potentially, that you may not currently be staffed to support. Conversely, you might want to consider public cloud. When you consider and deploy in a public cloud sort of environment, the entire infrastructure and more importantly, all of your core business systems are actually managed by a third party. The vendor or service provider provides all of the people resources, owns the infrastructure, all of the virtual machines, all of the applications, all of the storage is available not only to you, but to other companies just like yourself. So the vendor in a public cloud sort of deployment is actually going to be able to share the expense of that cloud infrastructure across literally hundreds or thousands of other shops, much like yourself. Whether you decide to go public or private cloud, either service is usually offered on a pay-as-you-go basis, hence the name software as a service, and usually available through monthly subscription rates. Usually, again, these public clouds will tend to be less expensive to you at the end of the day than private cloud deployments, simply because we're able to share that expense across hundreds or thousands of organizations. You know, another critical point I think of discussion is that every manufacturing company is going to have to weigh the pros and cons of being cloud enabled, especially if you decide to deploy your ERP solution in the cloud as well. In general, as a manufacturing company moves more of their core business processes to the cloud, there's going to be some real significant benefits. Traditionally, as you look at cloud deployments, they're tending to be more scalable. In other words, as you grow your business, as your manufacturing company grows, usually you should not have to see that same increase in cost. Again, because of that shared expense across that model. Usually in the old on-premise model, as you increase your usage or deployment of the solution, you're going to see the average cost per user not really decrease. Conversely, when you deploy something in the cloud, again, there's a certain amount of fixed expenses that obviously will go down over time just by virtue of adding more users. Obviously, another benefit of going to the cloud is just the availability of the applications. Again, no matter where you're at in the world, 24/7, 365, you're going to have availability as long as you have access to the internet. IT costs, especially upfront IT costs, are going to be probably greatly reduced. You don't need to have servers anymore. You don't need to worry about replacing servers every 2 to 3 or 4 years. You don't have to have heavy duty workstations anymore. Really, you just simply need a device, again, that can connect to the internet. We also generally see when people opt for cloud ERP systems that the speed of deployment is going to be much greater than the traditional on-premise model. Now, obviously, as you weigh the pros, you also need to potentially weigh some of the downside as well. In some cases, I would emphasize, again, in some cases, there may be limited customizability of the solution. Obviously, your own speed and uptime of the internet may come into play. There will be frequent updates. That's the benefit of the cloud. But again, conversely, there will be frequent updates. And so that may have some level of impact on your users. Now, keep in mind, the fact that those updates can be deployed very frequently means that in general, the scale or the magnitude of the update is much less. Again, if you think in the traditional on-premise world, a vendor might only deploy a release every 6 to 12 months. So that means that the updates are much bigger, probably much more disruptive to an organization. Generally in the cloud, you're going to potentially see weekly or monthly updates that happen. And again, thereby the scale of the update is that much less. So obviously there are pros and cons. So the big question at the end of the day is, how do you start mitigating some of the issues related to those cons? Let's talk security first. That's probably big on everyone's mind. It's definitely a valid concern when you start moving your data out there to the cloud. You know, one of the things that I will say is security used to be the number one reason that manufacturing companies chose not to deploy in the cloud. Manufacturers, by their nature, tend to be very conservative. They're very protective of their data. But one of the things that I can tell you is that a recent study just showed that actually security is now the number one reason that manufacturing companies are actually choosing to go to the cloud. If you think about all of the different viruses, all of the different malware that is being developed literally every single day, quite honestly, no small manufacturer would ever be able to keep up with that. With that said, you should obviously still vet out your potential cloud service provider, your cloud ERP provider. They should definitely have security protocols in place. protocols that are going to prevent people from trying to hack into their system, deterrent protocols that will potentially communicate proactively with people that are trying to hack in to those infrastructures. They should also have detective and corrective protocols in place as well. So as you look out and vet potential ERP vendors that are deploying in the cloud, these are some typical certifications that you should look for. For example, SSAE 16. This is basically the certification that an outside auditor has actually tested the accuracy and all of the controls and the implementation of those controls with that particular vendor. If you're ITAR compliant, if you deal with aerospace and defense, partnering with the cloud provider that's also ITAR compliant is going to be critical. Another certification you may want to look for is the EU-US Privacy Shield. Again, certain countries have certain protocols related to the privacy and integrity of personal data. A lot of times people talk about country of origin when it comes to data. So again, as you look at and vet out your ERP cloud vendor, these are all really critical things that you need to take a look at. You know, beyond security, the other thing that you should also keep in mind is potentially the total cost of ownership. Many owners of small companies have a fear that because it is a pay-as-you-go sort of a solution, that the longer you have the solution, the more costs that you're going to incur. And at some point, you may even surpass the cost of an on-premise solution. What I will tell you is this, is that it's actually not often that case. If you actually look at several studies that have been done, they actually prove out that the total cost of ownership when you move to the cloud is anywhere from 50 to 75% less than a traditional on-premise model. And a lot of that is because of all the hidden costs that you're going to save when you actually move to the cloud. Now, one of the challenges I will kind of end with is the whole challenge of, well, if I go to the cloud and I do want to change something, if I do want to customize something, if I do want to adapt something to the way that I do things, am I limited in terms of the cloud ERP solution that I might choose? And again, if you think about it, in the old days, what did you do? In the old on-premise world, you potentially went back to the vendor, you worked with the vendor, you paid the vendor to make a customization. However, some of you may have experienced that the customization might have been very expensive. It probably locked you into that version of the software. If you did want to upgrade to the next version of the software, you had to pay for that customization all over again. In the early days of cloud, it was probably even worse than that. In the early days of cloud ERP solutions, albeit just maybe 4 or 5 years ago, the advantage again to the vendor is that, hey, we're going to deploy one version of the software literally to everyone. And so in the early days of cloud ERP, the vendor had no capability at all to make any sort of customization. You know, truth be told, even though you're all machine shops, I can bet that every one of your operations is just a little bit different. You all have the core things that all of you should be doing in a very specific way, sort of an industry best practice. But, you know, every solution should also give you that option, if you ever need it, to configure those things that do make you unique and make you different than every other shop that's out there. You should be able to do those changes easily. You should be able to make those changes without having to know any sort of programming language. And probably you need to be assured that with the next upgrade, the next deployment, that configurability or that customization that you made isn't going to go away. So, what should a manufacturer do if you do need to customize something and you do want to be in the cloud? First, I think you need to make sure that the systems that you're looking at and the systems that you're evaluating meet a good portion of your requirements out of the box. Probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 75 to 80% of what you need a system should do should be provided to you right out of the box. But then you need to evaluate how easy it is to make changes to the system if you need to be able to do that. You should be able to make those changes, small or big, without having to constantly go back to the vendor. And most importantly, as I've mentioned, you should be assured that those changes that you make should be insulated and separated from everyone else, right? And that those customizations or changes are going to be there with the next deployment of the next upgrade. So, at a minimum, these are the things that you should be able to do in the system, regardless of what ERP solution it potentially might be. You should be able to change field names or field types, for example, where it makes sense. You might like to call something a job. The vendor actually called it a work order. You should be able to make those changes on your own. You should be able to actually add new fields wherever it makes sense, whether it's on screens, on reports, on quick queries. You should be able to potentially rearrange fields or adjust fields from being required to not required, or vice versa. You should be able to adjust the size of fields and to be able to do all of that without having to know any sort of programming language. You might even want to go in and be able to change the business logic of the program itself where necessary, to match what your business process is. Because at the end of the day, what you want an ERP system to enable you to be is more agile at a reduced cost and to be able to maintain your differentiation and your competitive advantage. With that, let's wrap up for today and just real quickly talk about some tactical next steps if you decide that a move to the cloud potentially makes sense for your company. First and foremost, transition in a methodical way. This is probably not an overnight decision. I think first off, you need to understand what your current state of affairs is. You need to understand how you're interacting with customers today, and maybe more importantly, how do you want to interact with those customers in the future? You need to consider the same thing for suppliers. You need to understand how your employees are going to engage with and want to work in the new world. Do you have employees that are primarily remote that may never ever come into the office? You should also really evaluate, I think, as well, kind of your level of what I would call technology adoption or your risk aversion to technology. The next thing I think you need to do is to focus on those areas that are going to gain you the greatest return. Obviously, ERP solutions touch all parts of your business. And so what you really want to evaluate, obviously, are those areas of change, if you do decide to deploy a new ERP solution, that are going to gain you the greatest return. I think you also need to understand a little bit about your culture. Potentially, culture will put up some roadblocks to success. The other thing, it's very important to engage with the right technology partners. Just like you engage with the right machine tool providers and vendors on the shop floor, the same holds true, I think, for your business systems as well. And the other thing, you obviously want to stay committed. This is a long-term strategic initiative, and I think you really need to treat it as such. Then you have to have a plan, and you have to create a plan. You have to identify, I think, and discover those applications and processes that really make sense to move to the next generation solution. You have to analyze and assess how the various applications that you may want to deploy and the business processes you need to conform to, how is that all going to look in your next generation solution? You need to decide, obviously, what applications and what part of the business maybe to move to the cloud. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it's probably a migration to the cloud rather than an all or nothing approach. You need to measure and kind of compare where you are today versus what it will give you in the future. And then finally, just like with any initiative, you have to proactively optimize and go back and always evaluate kind of the benefits that you've gained. With that, I'm going to go ahead and close the formal part of the presentation today. I just want to again thank all of the folks at Gardner Publications, especially Modern Machine Shop, for allowing us to be a part of this event today. I hope you all found the content worthwhile. I always gauge the success by potentially the number of questions it may raise in your mind, not just the questions that we have answered on the call today. With that, I'll go ahead and put up my content slide. We may have had a few questions that came into the Q&A panel. So with that, I'll turn it back to the webinar organizers, and we'll go through any of those questions at this point, if there are any.
Thank you, Dave. That was a very interesting presentation. So before we transition to the Q&A, I just want to mention that the webinar is being recorded, and viewers will receive a follow-up email with a link to it, so you can revisit this whenever you like. While we've received some good questions from the audience already, there's still time for you to submit one. Go ahead and type it into the question pane at the right of your screen, and we'll do our best to get to it. So Dave, first question here. Person is asking, my company is currently considering whether to upgrade our on-premise solution or go to the new cloud version. What should I consider, and should I evaluate other vendors?
Yeah, you know, that's a really great point. And I think it kind of goes back to, you know, the responsiveness of your current vendor. Does that vendor really kind of fit, and has he traditionally provided you a solution that works? You know, sometimes as I look at shops, and especially machine shops, very often the way that you were 20 years ago is not the way that you are today. And so I think that's a key consideration for sure, is has your business changed? You know, have you moved into being more a repetitive manufacturer when you were a job shop 20 years ago? So I think that's part of the issue, because again, remember kind of where that vendor is coming from. They probably have a good number of customers that are on their on-premise solution. And just from a pure business standpoint, it's going to make sense, even if they rewrote their new cloud solution from the ground up, they still have to at some level believe that they are going to migrate their on-premise customers over to that solution. So very often they have to kind of keep that cloud solution very similar to their on-premise solution. So absolutely, even though you may have a trusted relationship with that vendor, I would also always encourage anyone to look at the other options that are going to be out there for you. Again, you'll get different perspectives from the different vendors, and ultimately you may find a solution that actually out of the box again meets more of your needs than that vendor that you have been with for 20 years or so. So I think whenever you make these kind of big decisions that will have an impact across a good portion of the company, it's always best to bring in maybe a couple of other vendors and consider what they have as well. Great question, though.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Another question here. I have heard the break-even point for cloud ERP versus on-premise ERP is about 5 years, when my investment in a cloud solution would be more than on-premise. Can you explain that a bit more, and is that actually true?
Yeah, great question. Again, probably came from an accountant who's very savvy on that financial model, as it were. So really great question. If you kind of look at it, the way that traditionally a cloud ERP vendor probably sets up their model is that, let's just take some round numbers. Let's say your on-premise vendor sells a solution for $4,000 per named user, let's say. If you go to a cloud vendor, they probably have amortized the purchase price of that software probably over a 3 to 5 year model. And so that's where that magic number typically comes from. So at that level, that is probably true. Now, again, as one of the slides that I had in the presentation hopefully articulated, besides that initial kind of what I would call software cost, there's all sorts of other costs that you need to also consider in a traditional on-premise world where you are, in essence, managing the application yourself. That usually means that you need a file server. Usually means that you need some pretty high-powered servers. Probably means that you have to have somebody on staff to kind of manage that infrastructure and all of those other costs. Then you have all of the other training costs and various things. And then, oh, by the way, all of that hardware that you bought today is probably good maybe for 3 years at the most. And so you probably are on a 3-year or more frequent hardware replacement strategy, or you should be. So the issue is all of those other traditional costs that you would have in an on-premise world almost go completely away. If you think about it, remember, you only need to be able to access the internet. So I don't have to worry about, in a cloud deployment, file servers and high-powered workstations and all sorts of things like that. So what I can tell you is that absolutely, from a software cost standpoint, that 3 to 5 year kind of break even or crossover is probably true. But again, keep in mind that in an on-premise world, you're going to have a lot of other costs to consider in that model as well. So don't get just simply caught up in the kind of what I would call the initial purchase price of the software. It usually is a much kind of bigger decision. And again, as I mentioned, studies have been done that say kind of over time, when you look at the total cost of ownership, typically you'll see that when all of the costs are considered, cloud deployments are going to be less expensive.
Yeah, I guess I would think too that there would be added stress with an on-premise version in terms of just keeping the data backed up and safe.
Everything, right? It's what if the on-premise solution goes down? What if the file server crashes? And, there's all of these other, what I kind of call soft costs that at some point are going to have a value as well, or a cost implication. So for sure, I mean, just the cost of not having the headache of, maintaining your core business system and pushing that off to an expert there's some definite benefit there as well, for sure.
Yeah, that lets the shop concentrate on their core value, which is machining parts.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
So another question here: if a solution is configurable, what extra pressure does that put on my shop?
Yeah, yeah. So, and it gets back to, kind of what is the configurability model that the vendor is offering to you. Even though something is written in the cloud for the cloud, you still have potentially that traditional model where the vendor is using some sort of programming language, and obviously creating it such a way to present web pages versus, the traditional screens in an on-premise solution. Um, so in that sort of an environment, even though the vendors may say that it's configurable, it still means that you have to learn programming language. You have to be a .NET expert or whatever the case may be, whatever programming language the vendor used. There are certain vendors out there, Keyden, for example, being one of them, where we've foregone the traditional, hey, I'm going to sit down and write millions of lines of code, to what we call a rapid development platform. When you develop a solution on a platform like that, number one, I don't need to know any sort of programming language anymore. I really just need to be a good kind of business analyst. So from that aspect, the pressure on the organization is you need to have someone obviously on staff that knows your business. Now, hopefully that's you, the owner, or some other key individual. The nice thing is they don't have to be technology experts. They don't have to know programming language. You just have to have good business logic, in essence. So really, at the end of the day, when you choose the right solution, that's the pressure. I have to have someone on staff that knows the business, probably knows all of the business end to end, and that can somehow map out, that customization in terms of how it impacts the various key areas. So there is some level of pressure to the organization, but it's not a pressure of learning a new language, learning new programming skills. It's really just being a good business analyst.
Gotcha. We're at the top of the hour now. We've got one more question here. Person says we're a small shop and really only doing a handful of jobs. How do we find the time to make the leap to cloud-based ERP?
Yeah, that's another really great question. Probably the easy answer is there's probably no good time, right? When you're small, you're wearing lots of hats, and making the leap to any sort of technology is always a challenge. But then conversely, when you grow to a much larger organization, then typically you become so busy making parts. And so the short answer is there's probably never a good time. What I will say, and again, this gets back hopefully to the value proposition of going to cloud. In the traditional days, ERP systems used to be really, really expensive, both from just the acquisition cost plus the cost of getting it up and running, and it was just not affordable to a very small company. The good news is obviously the investment cost is pretty minimal. So the exciting thing is very small shops are coming to vendors like us when they are that 3, 4, 5 employee company, and really finding it very affordable. It's really easy to justify, maybe a few $100s a month versus a $30,000 investment. So from that standpoint, we kind of hopefully eliminate a lot of the objection when it comes to, investment. It still requires time. But again, the nice thing with these kind of modular, and I hate to say modular because when you go to cloud, you get everything. But the nice thing about a cloud solution is because it has such a small footprint, in terms of what is required on your side, you can get involved with that solution on a pretty minimal basis. And again, because it's potentially maybe only $100 or $200 or $500 a month, you can justify that even though I might only be using 10% of the capability. So I actually think that as a small company, it's a great investment opportunity. I can get started in an application at a really low investment point, and it just makes a whole lot of sense. You still need time, but again, you don't have to do everything at once. Using only 10% of the solution and paying a few $100s a month, it's pretty easy to justify that.
Yeah. Awesome. Good deal. Well, that's all the time we have for the webinar today. We hope you found it helpful. If you have any other questions, or if perhaps you're viewing a recorded version of this webinar, you can go ahead and contact Dave. His email is on the screen, as is his phone number, and he'll get back to you as soon as he can. So on behalf of Modern Machine Shop and Keyed In, thanks for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.